The Staten Island Boogeyman, the tunnel mystery. Come closer, because most horror stories ask you to imagine somewhere remote. A forest, a mountain, a stretch of highway with no lights and no houses and no reason to stop. This one asks you to imagine something different. It asks you to imagine a perfectly ordinary borough of New York City, expressways and strip malls and school buses and Saturday morning soccer games, and then to imagine, directly beneath it, a network of tunnels that the city built, abandoned, sealed, and has declined to discuss in any detail ever since. And then to consider what, over the decades, has been reported living inside them. Part 1. The Borough. Staten Island is the forgotten borough. That designation is affectionate among its residents and geographical among everyone else, separated from Manhattan by the Kill Van Cole and Upper New York Bay, connected to Brooklyn by the Verrazzano Narrows Bridge and to Manhattan by a ferry that residents ride with the weary patience of people who have been making the same commute for decades. It is the most suburban of the 5 boroughs, the most residential, the most insular. Its neighborhoods have the particular density of places where people know their neighbors and keep their business to themselves. Beneath those neighborhoods, beginning in the 1920s and continuing through several interrupted decades of construction, the city of New York carved out the beginnings of what was intended to be a comprehensive rapid transit system for Staten Island, a network of tunnels and stations that would connect the borough to the larger subway grid and eventually to New Jersey. The project was ambitious, expensive, and repeatedly defunded. Portions were built, portions were abandoned mid-construction, and when the political will and the municipal budget failed for the final time, the city did what cities do with things they cannot finish and cannot afford to demolish. They sealed them. They put the plans in a filing cabinet somewhere, and they sealed the tunnel entrances with concrete and steel and chain link fencing, and they let the decades do the rest. And they did not, as a general institutional policy, encourage questions about what was down there. The tunnels are still down there. Part 2. The History. The specific sections most associated with what locals call the abandoned Staten Island tunnels run beneath the neighborhoods of St. George and Arlington and Clifton, areas where, if you know what to look for, the geography occasionally betrays the infrastructure beneath. Subtle depressions in the ground, ventilation grates set into sidewalks that exhale a specific cold, damp air that smells of concrete and depth and age. Walls in the basements of older commercial buildings that, when examined closely, reveal bricked-over doorways that lead, according to the building's original plans, nowhere that the current structure accounts for. Workers who encountered these tunnels during road construction and utility work over the decades filed reports that varied in their specificity but agreed on the essentials. The tunnels were substantial, full height, built to accommodate trains that were never run, their platforms still intact in places, their tiled walls still bearing the ghost of signage for stations that never opened. They were also, by the time any of these workers encountered them, not empty. Not in the way an abandoned space is supposed to be empty. The reports described, in the careful language of municipal workers filing official paperwork, evidence of occupation, makeshift shelters constructed from materials that had been carried into the tunnels rather than left there by construction crews, fire rings, ash and charred wood, still warm in some accounts, indicating recent use, food containers, clothing. In at least 2 reports filed with the New York City Transit Authority in the 1980s, the workers described having the specific, unambiguous experience of being watched from the darkness beyond the reach of their work lights. Not seeing anyone, just knowing with the certainty that the body sometimes arrives at before the mind does, that something in the dark was aware of them. Part 3. The residents. The population of people living in the tunnel systems beneath New York City is not a secret. It has been documented extensively. Journalists, social workers, and urban explorers have written about the mole people, as they have been called, the individuals who, for reasons of mental illness, addiction, poverty, or deliberate rejection of surface life, have taken up residence in the abandoned infrastructure beneath the city. They live beneath Grand Central, beneath Riverside Park, in service tunnels and utility corridors and decommissioned sections of the active subway system. The Staten Island tunnels present a different quality of account. What distinguishes the reports from beneath Staten Island from the broader mole people documentation is not the existence of tunnel residents. That is documented and, in its way, explicable. It is the specific texture of the encounters. The workers in the 1980s reports did not describe evidence of the kind of makeshift community that social workers had documented elsewhere. They described something more solitary and more deliberate. The shelters were not grouped. There was no evidence of the social infrastructure, the organization, the resource sharing that characterized other tunnel communities. What the evidence suggested, in each case, was one presence, a single occupant, a person or something that moved like a person, that had arranged its existence in the deepest and least accessible section of the tunnel and had been there long enough that the space bore the accumulated marks of extended habitation. One transit worker, interviewed by a local Staten Island newspaper in 1993 and identified only by his first name, Robert, described entering a section of the Arlington Tunnel during a routine inspection and finding, at the furthest accessible point from the entrance, a space that had been cleared and arranged with a specificity that he found, in his own word, intentional. Objects were placed rather than discarded. A territory had been established, and in the darkness at the far end of the cleared space, beyond the reach of his flashlight, in the particular black that exists at the back of a tunnel that has not seen daylight in 50 years, something moved. He left. He did not file a formal report of what he had seen. He said, in the 1993 interview, that he did not think it would be well received. Part 4. The children. The aspect of the Staten Island tunnel accounts that local historians and paranormal researchers have found most persistent and most difficult to dismiss as the product of overactive imaginations is the children's testimony. Beginning in the late 1970s and continuing through the 1990s, children from the neighborhoods above the tunnel routes reported encounters that their parents, in most cases, attributed to imagination or to the ordinary production of fear that children are capable of when they spend time near places they have been told not to go. The ventilation grates, the chain link fences over sealed entrance shafts, the places in the sidewalk where the ground sounds hollow underfoot. Children are drawn to these things. They are drawn to edges. What multiple children, across multiple neighborhoods and multiple decades, independently reported was this: a figure, seen through ventilation grates, glimpsed at the edges of fenced tunnel entrances, visible for a moment in the pale light that fell into the shafts before the darkness swallowed it. Tall, moving in a specific way that children, lacking the vocabulary of the uncanny, described with the directness of people who have not yet learned to doubt what they see. One child, a girl of approximately 10, interviewed by her school's counselor in 1981 after she became distressed following a walk home from school, described a face at a ventilation grate, looking up through the grate from below, which meant it had been positioned in the tunnel with its face at street level, watching the feet of people walking above it. She described the eyes as very pale. She described them as knowing exactly where to look. The counselor noted this in her file and referred the child for follow-up sessions. The follow-up sessions were not pursued. Part 5. The tunnels now. The sealed entrances are still there. Some have been covered by subsequent construction, roads widened, buildings extended, the geography of the borough shifting over the decades in ways that have buried the access points under additional layers of concrete and intention. Others are still visible if you know where to look. A chain-link fence beside a commercial building in St. George, a ventilation shaft behind a strip mall in Clifton, a section of old retaining wall in Arlington that has a different quality of age from the structures around it. Urban explorers have entered sections of the tunnels over the years, and their accounts are available in the places where such accounts are shared. Forums and video channels and the specific corners of the internet where people who go into abandoned places document what they find. The accounts are consistent in their description of the physical space, the full-height tunnels, the intact platforms, the tiled walls, and the ghost signage. They are also, more than occasionally, consistent in another detail: the feeling of being followed. Not seeing anyone, not finding evidence, in most cases, of current occupation, though some explorers have documented what appear to be recent fire rings in the deeper sections, and one widely circulated account from 2019 describes finding, in a section of tunnel near the Arlington station platform, a cleared space with objects arranged in a way the author described as deliberate and considered, which is almost exactly the language Robert the transit worker used in 1993. Maybe it's a person. Maybe it's several people, across several decades. Someone who chose the dark over the surface. That would be explicable. That would be human. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe the pale eyes at the grates are something else. Maybe the feeling of being watched from a dark your flashlight cannot reach is pointing at something the word person was never built to hold. The sealed entrances do not answer that question. They just hold it. Down there, beneath the soccer games, beneath the school buses, beneath the strip malls and the ordinary Saturday mornings of the forgotten borough. Something has been watching the feet go by above the grates for a very long time, and it has learned, if nothing else, a great deal of patience. Until next time, sleep well, my friend.